The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door while Maya Rodriguez was getting her daughter ready for school. She found it after dropping Lucia off, the orange paper stark against the worn hallway carpet of their studio apartment. 30 days. The words felt less like a warning and more like a countdown to something inevitable. She stood there holding it, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, not from fear exactly, but from the exhausting weight of being unsurprised. This was the third notice in 2 years, each one following the same pattern. A landlord who raised rent beyond reason, a job that paid just enough to fall short, and the grinding arithmetic of survival that never quite added up. Maya had worked as a seamstress at a small alteration shop downtown for 6 years. The pay was modest but reliable, the hours predictable enough to build a life around. She had learned to measure her world in careful increments. Grocery budgets calculated to the dollar. Bus fare counted in exact change. Lucia's school supplies purchased months in advance when sales made them affordable. It was a system that worked until it didn't. The breaking point had come 3 months earlier when the shop owner announced he was selling the business. The new owners had different plans. They wanted to modernize, to focus on high-end clientele, to eliminate what they called redundant positions. Maya's role had been deemed redundant. The severance was 2 weeks' pay and an apology that felt rehearsed. Since then, she had applied to 47 different positions. She kept count in a notebook, each application marked with a date and a brief description. Retail associate, office cleaner, warehouse packer, restaurant server. Most never responded. A few sent automated rejections. 3 granted interviews that led nowhere. The reasons varied, but the result was always the same. Not enough experience. Overqualified. Position filled. Her savings, modest to begin with, had drained with alarming speed. Rent consumed most of what remained. Utilities took their share. Food for Lucia came next, always before food for herself. The rest disappeared into the countless small expenses that poverty amplified. A broken phone charger that needed replacing immediately. Late fees on bills she couldn't quite pay on time. Bus fare to interviews that yielded nothing. By the time the eviction notice arrived, her bank account held $372. Rent was $850. The math was simple and unforgiving. That evening, after Lucia had gone to bed in the corner that served as her bedroom, Maya sat at the kitchen table and spread out the paperwork that governed her life. Bills arranged by urgency. Job applications sorted by response date. A list of emergency contacts, most of whom she had already exhausted. At the bottom of the pile was a letter she had been avoiding for weeks. It had arrived from a law office in a city she had never visited, addressed to her in formal language that made her immediately suspicious. She had nearly thrown it away, assuming it was some kind of scam. But something about the weight of the paper, the precision of the printing, had made her hesitate. She had opened it carefully and read it 3 times before allowing herself to believe it might be real. The letter informed her that a distant relative, a great-aunt she barely remembered meeting, had passed away and named her as a beneficiary in the will. There was no money, the letter explained carefully. No stocks or bonds. Only a property, described in legal terms as a commercial structure in a state of significant disrepair. The letter included an address, a brief description, and a note from the executor suggesting she visit before making any decisions about the inheritance. Maya had researched the property immediately, finding it easily enough through online records. The building was listed as a former watch factory, operational from the early 1900s until its closure in the 1980s. The structure had been abandoned for decades, passing through several owners who had done nothing with it. Photos showed a hulking brick building with broken windows and overgrown grounds. Municipal records listed it as condemned, pending demolition. The tax assessment valued it at $850. She had laughed when she read that number, not with humor, but with the bitter recognition that even a property worth almost nothing might still be worth more than what she currently had. The factory was located in a town she had never heard of, a place that appeared on maps as little more than a crossroads between larger cities. The executor's letter had been clear. She could accept the inheritance, which would include responsibility for property taxes and any demolition costs if she chose not to maintain it. Or she could decline, and the building would revert to the state. For weeks, she had done neither. The letter sat in the pile of paperwork, a problem deferred because every other problem felt more immediate. But now, holding the eviction notice and staring at her dwindling savings, the factory began to look less like an absurd inheritance and more like the only option left. The thought was ridiculous, she knew. Moving to an unfamiliar town with no job prospects, no housing, and a condemned building as her only asset made no logical sense. She had explained this to herself repeatedly. But logic had limits when rent was due and options had vanished. Sometimes the ridiculous was all that remained. She called the executor's office the next morning, speaking to a secretary who sounded unsurprised by her decision to visit the property. Arrangements were made for her to receive the keys and complete the necessary paperwork. The trip would cost her nearly $100 in bus fare and a night in the cheapest motel she could find. It was money she could not afford to spend. It was also money she could not afford not to spend. 3 days later, Maya and Lucia boarded a bus headed east, carrying 2 suitcases that held everything they owned that mattered. Lucia pressed her face against the window as the city disappeared behind them, replaced by stretches of farmland and small towns that blurred together. She asked questions Maya could not fully answer. Where were they going? How long would they stay? What would their new home look like? Maya answered with the careful optimism she had learned to fake when reality felt too harsh to share. They were going on an adventure. They would stay as long as it took to figure things out. Their new home would be different, but different could be good. Lucia accepted this with the trust children extend to parents, unaware of how fragile that trust felt in moments like these. The town appeared gradually as the bus wound through rolling hills. It was smaller than Maya had imagined, a main street lined with buildings that looked like they had been waiting decades for renewal. A few shops were open. A hardware store, a diner with faded awnings, a pharmacy with hand-painted signs. Most of the storefronts were dark, their windows empty or papered over. The bus stopped at a corner gas station that served as the unofficial depot. Maya stepped off, holding Lucia's hand tightly, and looked around at the place that might become their future. The air smelled different here, cleaner but emptier, as if the town itself had learned to exist quietly. She had arranged to meet the executor at his office, a small suite above an insurance agency on the main street. The man who greeted her was older, formal in manner, but not unkind. He handed her a folder containing the deed, tax records, and a set of keys that looked like they had not been used in years. He explained the legal details with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The property was hers. The taxes were minimal but would need to be paid annually. The structure was not safe for habitation in its current state. Demolition would be her responsibility if she chose that path. When she asked if there was anything else she should know, he paused, choosing his words carefully. The building had a history, he said. People in town remembered it as the largest employer before the factory closed. Its abandonment had hurt the community. Some viewed it with nostalgia. Others saw it as a reminder of failure. She should be prepared for mixed reactions. Maya thanked him and left with the keys in her pocket and a folded map showing the factory's location. It was a 20-minute walk through residential streets that gradually gave way to industrial lots and empty fields. Lucia walked beside her, quieter now, sensing her mother's tension. The factory appeared suddenly, looming behind a rusted fence that sagged in several places. It was larger than the photos had suggested, a sprawling brick structure that stretched across what must have been several acres. The windows were indeed broken, many covered with boards that had themselves weathered and warped. The main entrance was chained shut, though the chain hung loose where someone had cut through it years ago. Maya stood at the fence, staring at the building that was now technically hers. It looked less like an inheritance and more like a burden someone had been desperate to pass on. Lucia tugged at her sleeve, asking if they were really going to live there. Maya did not answer immediately. She was calculating, a habit she could not break even when the numbers refused to cooperate. $850. That was what she had paid with her last savings to accept this property. It was also the exact amount she owed in rent back in the city. The symmetry felt either cosmically ironic or deliberately cruel. They approached the building slowly, finding a gap in the fence wide enough to slip through. The grounds were overgrown, weeds pushing through cracked pavement. Debris was scattered everywhere. Broken glass, rusted metal, pieces of machinery too heavy to have been stolen, but too damaged to be worth salvaging. The main entrance was secured with a newer padlock, likely added by the municipality to prevent trespassing. Maya tried the keys the executor had given her, finding one that fit. The lock opened with a protest of rust and neglect. She pushed the door inward, and it moved slowly, scraping against the floor. Inside, the factory was dark, lit only by the broken windows and gaps in the roof. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their entry. The space was vast, a single open floor that stretched beyond what her eyes could adjust to. Metal pillars rose at regular intervals, supporting a ceiling crisscrossed with exposed beams and hanging cables. The floor was concrete, stained and cracked, littered with debris that had accumulated over decades. Maya stepped inside carefully, testing each footfall before committing her weight. Lucia stayed close, her hand gripping her mother's tightly. The building creaked around them, settling sounds that felt unnervingly alive. Along the walls, remnants of the factory's past remained. Workbenches bolted to the floor, shelving units stripped of their contents. A large piece of machinery near the center of the room, its purpose unclear, its surface rusted beyond recognition. Everything that could be removed had been. What remained was the skeleton of something that had once been vital and now felt haunted by its own obsolescence. Maya moved deeper into the space, her initial assessment hardening into certainty. The building was not livable, not even close. The roof leaked in multiple places. The windows were security risks. The structure itself might not be sound. Every practical instinct told her to walk away, to return to the city and find some other solution, any other solution. But as she stood there in the failing light, another thought pushed through. She had nowhere else to go. The eviction notice was final. Her savings were gone. Job prospects remained non-existent. This building, broken and condemned as it was, represented the only thing she owned in the world besides the 2 suitcases waiting outside. She had not come here with a plan. She had come because desperation had narrowed her choices to one. But standing in the hollow center of the factory, she began to formulate something that resembled intention. If she could make even a small part of this building habitable, it would solve the most immediate problem. Shelter. It would not be comfortable. It might not even be safe in any conventional sense, but it would be hers. The practicalities overwhelmed her almost immediately. She had no tools, no construction experience, no money to hire help. The building needed everything, and she had nothing. Yet the alternative was homelessness, and she had a daughter depending on her. That single fact overrode every logical objection. That night, they stayed in the cheapest motel within walking distance, a place that charged by the hour but reluctantly agreed to rent by the night when Maya explained her situation. Lucia fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day. Maya lay awake, staring at the stained ceiling, running calculations that refused to balance. In the morning, she returned to the factory alone, leaving Lucia with the motel clerk who had taken pity on them. She walked through the building more methodically this time, assessing what might be salvageable. Near the back of the main floor, she found a smaller room that had once served as an office or break room. It had walls on 3 sides, a door that still closed, and a window that was cracked but not shattered. The roof above appeared more intact than the rest of the building. This, she decided, would be their starting point. If she could secure the window, seal the door, and clear the debris, it might serve as a temporary living space. It was not a home. It was barely shelter. But it was possible. She spent the next 3 days making the space minimally functional. She bought supplies with what little money remained. Plastic sheeting, too. Cover the window. A cheap padlock for the door. cleaning supplies to scrub years of grime from the walls and floor. She worked with a desperate efficiency, aware that every dollar spent brought her closer to having nothing. The town noticed. Of course it did. A stranger moving into the condemned factory was news in a place where news was scarce. People watched from across the street, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. A few approached, asking questions she answered with practiced vagueness. She was fixing up the property. She was considering her options. She appreciated their concern, but did not need help. The truth was more complicated. She needed help desperately, but had no way to ask for it without revealing just how precarious her situation was. Admitting that she was living in a condemned building with her daughter would invite attention she could not afford. Social services, code enforcement, well-meaning intervention that would separate her from Lucia faster than poverty ever could. So she lied by omission, smiled when necessary, and worked when no one was watching. The mockery began subtly. A comment from a woman at the hardware store about city people who thought they could fix everything. A man at the diner who asked loudly whether she had bought the factory or just wandered into it by mistake. Laughter that followed her down the street when she carried supplies back to the building. None of it was overtly cruel. Small towns had their own codes of behavior, and outright hostility was rare. But the judgment was unmistakable. She was an outsider. She had made a foolish decision. She would fail, and when she did, they would not be surprised. Maya absorbed it without response. She had learned long ago that defending yourself to people who had already decided you were wrong was a waste of energy. What mattered was not their opinion, but her ability to prove them irrelevant. By the end of the first week, she had transformed the small room into something barely functional. 2 sleeping bags on the floor, a battery-powered lamp for light, their clothes folded neatly against the wall, a cooler for food, restocked daily from the convenience store. It was not a home, but it was shelter, and shelter was enough. Lucia adapted with the resilience of children who have no choice. She accepted the new routine without complaint, though Maya saw the worry in her eyes when she thought her mother was not looking. They ate meals sitting on the floor. They washed in the motel down the street when Maya could afford the fee. They slept side by side, the factory creaking around them like a ship at sea. During the day, while Lucia attended the local school, Maya searched for work. She applied to every business on the main street. She offered to clean, to organize, to do anything that needed doing. Most turned her away politely. A few were less polite. She was overqualified. She was underqualified. They were not hiring. The rejection was familiar, but the stakes felt higher now. Without income, the fragile arrangement she had built would collapse within weeks. It was during one of these long, empty afternoons, alone in the factory and trying not to think about how little food remained in the cooler, that Maya began to explore the building more thoroughly. She had been focused entirely on survival, on making the small room habitable. But the factory was vast, and she had seen only a fraction of it. She moved through the main floor carefully, stepping over debris and testing the stability of the ground before committing her weight. Most of what she found was worthless. Broken equipment, piles of scrap metal, evidence of vandalism and weather damage that had compounded over decades. But near the far corner, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit, she noticed something that made her pause. A door. Heavy, industrial, its surface painted the same gray as the walls and covered with enough grime to blend into the background. She might have missed it entirely if the angle of the afternoon light had not caught the outline of the frame. Maya approached it slowly, her heartbeat quickening with something she could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the desperate hope that there might be something here, anything, that could change the equation of her situation. The door had no handle, only a keyhole set into a reinforced plate. She tried the keys from the executor, cycling through each one until the 4th key slid in and turned with a heavy click. The door resisted at first, swollen with age and moisture. She pulled hard, and it gave way suddenly, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled of earth and metal. Beyond the door was darkness, absolute and deep. She retrieved the battery-powered lamp from her makeshift living space and returned, shining the light into the void. A staircase descended steeply, concrete steps leading down into what appeared to be a basement or sublevel. The walls were bare concrete, the air noticeably cooler. She hesitated, every instinct warning her that exploring alone was reckless. But the alternative was returning to the small room and waiting for the inevitable moment when her money ran out entirely. She descended slowly, the lamp casting long shadows that moved with her. The staircase was longer than she expected, dropping at least 20 feet before opening into a corridor. The passage was narrow, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that looked decades old. Several doors branched off the main corridor, each as heavy and industrial as the first. She tried the nearest door, finding it locked. The next was the same. The third door, however, opened when she turned the handle, revealing a small room that appeared to have been used for storage. Metal shelves lined the walls, most of them empty. A few boxes remained, their contents long since deteriorated into unrecognizable masses. She continued down the corridor, her sense of unease growing with each step. This was not a typical basement. The construction was too deliberate, the materials too heavy. This space had been designed to secure something, to protect it from intrusion or discovery. At the end of the corridor, she found the largest door yet. It was set into a reinforced frame, the metal thick and unyielding. Above the door, barely visible beneath layers of dust, a faded sign read, "Vault Room. Authorized personnel only." Maya stared at the sign, her mind struggling to process what it implied. A vault, in a watch factory. She tried the door, unsurprised to find it locked. None of the keys she had worked. She examined the lock closely, recognizing it as something far more sophisticated than a standard door lock. This was a combination mechanism, heavy-duty, designed to resist tampering. She stepped back, frustration and curiosity warring within her. Whatever lay behind that door had been important enough to secure with serious intent. But without the combination, she had no way to access it. For a moment, she considered abandoning the idea entirely. She was living in a condemned building with no money and no prospects. The last thing she needed was to waste time obsessing over a locked door that probably led to nothing. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. On the wall beside the vault door, partially obscured by shadow, was a metal plate with numbers engraved into it. She moved closer, brushing away decades of dust to reveal a sequence: 14-22-08-35. Her heart beat faster. It could be anything: a manufacturer's code, a date, random numbers that meant nothing. Or it could be exactly what it appeared to be. She returned to the vault door and examined the combination lock more closely. It was a 4-number dial, worn but still functional. With careful movements, she turned the dial to match the sequence from the plate: 14, right to 22, left to 08, right to 35. The lock clicked. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but it resonated through the corridor like a gunshot. Maya stood frozen, her hand still on the dial, unable to believe what had just happened. The lock had opened. The combination had worked. She pulled the heavy door handle, and the vault door swung inward with a low groan. The air that escaped was different, colder and drier, as if the room beyond had been sealed for decades. She raised the lamp, and the light fell across the interior of the vault. What she saw made her breath catch. The room was not large, perhaps 15 feet on each side, but every surface was lined with shelves, and those shelves were filled with objects that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Metal boxes stacked with precision. Each box was identical in size and shape, their surfaces darkened with age, but still intact. Maya stepped inside slowly, her movements dreamlike. She approached the nearest shelf and lifted one of the boxes. It was heavier than it looked, the weight solid and definite in her hands. She set it down carefully on a lower shelf and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in protective foam that had compressed over time, were bars of metal. They were rectangular, uniform in size, and stamped with markings she did not immediately recognize. But even in the dim light, their luster was unmistakable. These are not steel, not iron. The weight, the color, the way the lamplight moved across their surface, this was something far more valuable. Her hands trembled as she lifted one bar free of the foam. It was cold to the touch, dense beyond anything she had ever held. She turned it over, examining the stamped markings more closely. Numbers, purity indicators, and a single word that made her stomach tighten: platinum. She looked around the vault with new eyes, counting the boxes visible from where she stood. 20, 30. More on shelves she could not yet reach. Each box appeared to hold multiple bars, stacked and protected with the same care. The implications crashed over her in waves. This was not scrap metal. This was not a forgotten inventory. This was wealth on a scale she could barely comprehend, hidden in a building everyone had assumed was worthless. Maya set the bar down carefully, her mind racing. Questions flooded in faster than she could process them. Why was this here? How long had it been sealed? Who had put it here, and why had they never returned? She thought of the executor, handing her the keys with barely concealed relief. Had he known? The way he had described the property, the careful language about significant disrepair, suddenly felt deliberate. He had wanted her to take this building off his hands. He had wanted someone else responsible for whatever secrets it held. She looked at the boxes again, at the bars of platinum stacked with military precision. She thought of the eviction notice, the empty bank account, Lucia sleeping in a room barely fit for habitation. And here, beneath their feet, lay a fortune that could change everything. For the first time since opening the envelope from the executor's office, Maya allowed herself to feel something other than desperation. It was not hope, not yet. Hope required certainty, and she had none. But it was possibility, fragile and dangerous, pressing against the edges of her exhausted pragmatism. She closed the box carefully and stepped back, looking at the vault one last time before extinguishing the lamp. The darkness returned, absolute and patient. She made her way back up the corridor, up the stairs, and into the dying light of the factory floor. Above her, the building creaked and settled. Outside, the town continued its quiet existence, unaware of what she had found. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. Tonight, she would return to the small room where her daughter slept and try to imagine what came next. But as she locked the vault door behind her and pocketed the keys, one thought repeated itself with undeniable clarity. Everything had changed. Maya did not sleep that night. She lay on the sleeping bag beside Lucia, staring at the ceiling of their makeshift room while her mind cycled through the same questions without resolution. The platinum bars existed. That much was certain. She had held them, felt their weight, seen the markings stamped into their surfaces. But existence alone meant nothing without understanding what they represented, how they had come to be there, and whether claiming them was even legally possible. By the time dawn filtered through the plastic-covered window, she had reached several conclusions. First, she could not tell anyone what she had found, not yet. The moment word spread, control would slip from her hands. People would arrive with claims, legal and otherwise. The town would transform from indifferent to intensely interested. She would become a target before she understood what she was defending. Second, she needed verification. The bars might be platinum, but they might also be something else entirely. Industrial byproduct. Worthless alloy. She had no expertise in precious metals, no way to confirm what her eyes and hands suggested. Until she knew for certain, the discovery remained theoretical. Third, and most unsettling, she had to determine whether the platinum legally belonged to her. The building was hers, documented and transferred through proper channels. But the contents of a sealed vault, hidden for decades, occupied a gray area she could not navigate without help. If the original owners or their descendants had claims, asserting ownership too quickly could invite legal action she had no resources to contest. These problems felt almost comforting in their complexity. They were solvable, or at least approachable. They gave her something to focus on beyond the grinding dailiness of survival. When Lucia woke, Maya fed her breakfast from their dwindling supplies and walked her to school, maintaining the routine that provided structure to their chaotic circumstances. She answered Lucia's questions with practiced calm, deflecting worry with vague reassurances. Everything was fine. They were settling in. Things would get better. After dropping Lucia off, Maya returned to the factory and locked the door behind her. She moved through the building with new awareness, seeing it not as a burden, but as a shell protecting something extraordinary. The broken windows and crumbling infrastructure no longer felt like evidence of failure. They felt like camouflage. She descended to the vault again, this time carrying a notebook and a measuring tape she had purchased days earlier for a purpose she had not yet defined. Inside the vault, she worked methodically, counting boxes and estimating their contents. 37 boxes in total. Each box appeared to contain between 10 and 12 bars. The bars themselves measured roughly 6 inches long, 3 inches wide, and 1 inch thick. She lifted several bars from different boxes, confirming they all bore similar weight and markings. The stamps were consistent, numbers indicating purity, codes she did not recognize, and the word platinum repeated on every surface. Some bars showed additional markings, dates from the 1970s and early 80s, suggesting they had been produced or acquired during the factory's final years of operation. As she worked, a theory began to form. The watch factory had closed in the mid-80s, a victim of foreign competition and changing markets. But before closing, someone had stockpiled these bars, perhaps as an investment, perhaps as insurance against an uncertain future. Then something had happened. The factory had been abandoned quickly. Ownership transferred multiple times, and the vault had been forgotten or deliberately hidden. The combination lock, so carefully secured, suggested the latter. Someone had intended to return. They had simply never done so. Maya spent 3 hours in the vault, documenting everything she could without disturbing the arrangement. She photographed the bars with her phone, capturing the markings in detail. She measured dimensions. She noted the condition of the boxes and foam. When she finally emerged, locking the vault behind her, she had a clearer picture of what she was dealing with, even if she did not yet understand its full implications. The next challenge was verification, and this required leaving the factory. She could not simply walk into a jewelry store or pawn shop with a platinum bar and ask for an appraisal. That would raise immediate questions and potentially alert people she was not ready to involve. She needed someone knowledgeable but discreet, someone who could confirm what the bars were without asking why she needed to know. She spent the afternoon at the town library, a small building on a side street that smelled of old paper and neglect. Using the public computer, she researched platinum, its properties, its market value, and how it was typically bought and sold. What she learned both excited and terrified her. Platinum was among the rarest precious metals, valued for its durability and resistance to corrosion. It was used in jewelry, yes, but more importantly in industrial applications. Catalytic converters, electronics, medical equipment. Its value fluctuated with market demand, but remained consistently high. Current prices hovered around $1,000 per troy ounce. She calculated quickly, converting the measurements she had taken into approximate weight. Each bar, if solid platinum, would weigh roughly 75 troy ounces. At current market rates, that meant each bar was worth approximately $75,000. Multiply that by the estimated number of bars, somewhere between 370 and 440, and the total value became staggering. Between $27 million and $33 million. The numbers felt abstract, disconnected from reality. She stared at the computer screen, rechecking her math, certain she had made an error. But the calculations held. If the bars were genuine, if they were pure platinum as the marking suggested, then the vault contained a fortune that dwarfed anything she had imagined when she first opened that door. She logged off the computer carefully, erasing her search history with the paranoia of someone who understood how quickly information could become evidence. Walking back to the factory, she forced herself to maintain a normal pace, to show nothing in her expression that might draw attention. Inside the small room where they lived, she sat on the floor and allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated astonishment. She had come to this town with $372 and a condemned building. Now she sat atop a vault containing wealth that could change not just her life, but generations to come. The absurdity of it threatened to overwhelm her. She, who had been evicted for failing to pay $850 in rent, now had access to millions. The symmetry was so perfect it felt like a cosmic joke. But the astonishment passed quickly, replaced by pragmatism. Numbers on a computer screen meant nothing. She needed verification from someone who could confirm the platinum's authenticity. And more urgently, she needed to understand whether she had any legal right to it. The following day, she took a calculated risk. She removed a single bar from the vault, wrapping it carefully in cloth and placing it in her backpack. She took the bus to a larger city 2 hours away, a place where she would not be recognized and where her questions would not immediately connect to the factory. In the city, she found a precious metals dealer, a small shop tucked between a tax preparation service and a dry cleaner. The storefront was modest, almost deliberately unremarkable. Inside, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from a workbench covered in tools and magnifying equipment. Maya had rehearsed her story on the bus. She was settling an estate. A relative had left behind items she needed appraised. She wanted to know their value before deciding what to do with them. It was close enough to the truth to sound believable. The man listened without expression, then gestured for her to place the item on the counter. Maya unwrapped the bar carefully, watching his face for any sign of recognition or alarm. He picked it up immediately, testing its weight, examining the stamped markings with professional interest. "Where did you say this came from?" he asked, not looking at her. "An estate," Maya repeated. "A family member who passed recently." He nodded slowly, still examining the bar. He produced a small file and scraped a corner carefully, collecting a tiny sample of metal. He applied acid to the sample, watching the reaction closely. After a moment, he looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "This is platinum," he said. "High purity, 99.9%, based on the markings and the test. Do you have more of these?" Maya's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "Possibly. Is it valuable?" The man set the bar down carefully, his demeanor shifting slightly. "At current market rates, this bar is worth approximately $72,000. If you have more, I'd be very interested in discussing a purchase." The confirmation hit her like physical force, but she maintained her composure. "I need to settle the estate first. Legal matters. You understand." He nodded, though his eyes lingered on the bar with obvious interest. "Of course. If you decide to sell, I'd appreciate the opportunity to make an offer. I can pay market rates, minus a small commission for processing." Maya rewrapped the bar and thanked him, leaving the shop with her backpack feeling heavier than when she had entered. Outside, she walked several blocks before allowing herself to stop and breathe. The platinum was real. The value was real. What she had found was not a fantasy born of desperation, but an actual fortune, hidden for decades and now, inexplicably, hers to claim. The bus ride back to the town felt longer than the journey out. She stared through the window at the passing landscape, her mind working through the next steps with careful deliberation. Verification was complete. Now she needed to address the legal questions that would determine whether any of this mattered. That evening, after Lucia had fallen asleep, Maya began researching property law and estate inheritance. The information was dense and contradictory, varying by state and circumstance. But certain principles emerged clearly. Property transferred through legal means typically included all contents unless explicitly excluded. The executor's letter had made no mention of reserving any items. The deed she had signed transferred the building and everything within it. But laws regarding found valuables were murky. If the platinum had been deliberately hidden with the intent to retrieve it later, and if the original owners or their heirs could prove ownership, they might have grounds for a claim. The fact that the vault had been sealed and the combination lock engaged suggested intentional concealment, which complicated matters. She needed legal advice, but obtaining it without revealing what she had found felt impossible. Any lawyer would ask questions she could not safely answer. The moment she mentioned platinum worth millions, confidentiality would become theoretical at best. As she wrestled with these problems, a knock came at the factory's main door. It was late, well after dark, and the sound jarred her from her thoughts. She froze, listening. The knock came again, more insistent. She approached the door carefully, checking through a gap in the boards covering the window. A woman stood outside, middle-aged, dressed practically, her expression difficult to read in the dim light from the street. Maya opened the door slightly, keeping the chain engaged. "Yes? Are you the one who inherited this place?" the woman asked, her tone neutral but direct. "I am. Can I help you?" The woman studied her for a moment before speaking. "My name is Helen Torres. My father worked in this factory for 30 years before it closed. I heard someone had finally taken ownership, and I wanted to, well, I'm not sure exactly. Talk, I suppose." Maya hesitated, then decided that refusing would draw more suspicion than allowing the conversation. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "Come in." Helen entered, looking around the vast, darkened space with an expression that mixed nostalgia and sadness. "I haven't been inside this building since I was a teenager. My father used to bring me here sometimes when he worked late. It's strange seeing it like this." "I imagine it is," Maya said carefully. "Did you want something specific?" Helen turned to face her. "I wanted to see if you were real. There are rumors in town. Some people think you're squatting. Others think you're planning to tear the place down for scrap. A few believe you're actually trying to restore it, though I'm not sure why anyone would." Maya said nothing, waiting. "I also wanted to warn you," Helen continued. "This factory, it has history, not all of it good. When it closed, people lost everything. Jobs disappeared. Families left town. The ones who stayed never really recovered. Some people blame the owners who shut it down. Others blame the economy. A few blame the workers themselves for demanding too much. The building became a symbol of all that resentment." "I appreciate the warning," Maya said, "but I'm not planning to do anything dramatic. I'm just trying to figure out my options." Helen nodded slowly. "Options. That's a kind word for what most people in this town don't have. Be careful. Buildings like this attract attention. Not always the kind you want." She left without elaborating, and Maya locked the door behind her, troubled by the conversation in ways she could not fully articulate. The warning had been vague, but sincere. Helen knew something, or suspected something, about the factory's history that she had not said outright. Maya returned to the small room where Lucia slept and sat against the wall, thinking. The platinum was real. The value was confirmed. But the complications were multiplying faster than she could address them. Legal uncertainty, town history, the growing sense that her discovery would not remain secret much longer. She needed help, someone with expertise she lacked, and discretion she could trust. The problem was trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability in her position felt like an invitation to disaster. The following morning, she made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. She called the executor's office and requested a meeting. When the secretary asked about the purpose, Maya kept her answer vague. Questions about the property transfer, details that needed clarification. The executor agreed to meet her that afternoon. Maya left Lucia with a neighbor who had shown kindness, a retired teacher who asked no questions when Maya explained she had an appointment in town. The executor's office felt different this time, less neutral and more deliberate. The man sat behind his desk, hands folded, watching her with the same careful professionalism he had shown before. But there was something else now, a wariness that suggested he had anticipated this conversation. "What can I help you with?" he asked. Maya chose her words carefully. "When I inherited the factory, the deed transferred the building and its contents. I wanted to confirm what that means legally. If something was left inside, something valuable, who would it belong to?" The executor's expression did not change, but his pause lasted a fraction too long. Legally, property transferred through a will includes all contents unless explicitly excluded. Your great-aunt owned the building at the time of her death, and nothing in the will reserved any specific items. So anything I find inside belongs to me? In principle, yes. Though if someone could prove prior ownership of specific items, especially if Those items were stolen or improperly acquired. They might have grounds for a claim. Context matters. Maya leaned forward slightly. Did my great-aunt know what was inside the building when she owned it? The executor met her gaze directly. Your great-aunt acquired the property through a tax auction 15 years ago. She never visited it. She paid the minimal taxes to maintain ownership and did nothing else. When she passed, she left it to you because you were her only surviving relative. I doubt she knew anything about its contents. But you do, Maya said quietly. The executor's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. I know that buildings like this often contain surprises. I also know that valuable surprises can complicate lives very quickly. If you found something, you should consult an attorney before taking any action. Can you recommend one? He wrote a name and number on a slip of paper and slid it across the desk. This is someone I trust. Discreet, competent, experienced in property disputes. Tell him I referred you. Maya took the paper, understanding what had just happened. The executor had confirmed, without confirming, that he knew or suspected what the factory contained. He had also made clear that he wanted no part of whatever came next. His role was complete. The rest was her burden. She left the office feeling both relieved and more isolated. Verification was no longer theoretical. The platinum was real. The inheritance appeared legally sound. And now she had the name of an attorney who might help her navigate what came next. But as she walked back toward the factory, she noticed something that made her slow her pace. A car was parked across the street from the building, engine off, windows tinted. She had never seen it before. As she approached, the car pulled away slowly, turning at the next corner and disappearing. The message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone had noticed. That night, after Lucia was asleep, Maya descended to the vault again. She stood in the doorway, looking at the boxes of platinum stacked with such precision. For weeks, she had lived in poverty so complete it had erased nearly every other consideration. Now she stood surrounded by wealth that defied comprehension, and all she felt was the weight of decisions she was not prepared to make. The platinum represented freedom, yes, but it also represented exposure, risk, and a level of responsibility she had never asked for. If she claimed it publicly, she would become a target. If she tried to sell it quietly, she would invite suspicion and potentially legal action. If she did nothing, she would remain trapped in precarity while sitting atop a fortune. She thought of Lucia, sleeping upstairs in a room barely fit for habitation. She thought of the eviction notice that had brought them here. She thought of every rejection, every closed door, every moment when the world had made clear that people like her did not matter. The platinum was hers. The law, as best she understood it, confirmed that. The question was not whether she had the right to it, but whether she had the courage to claim it. As she locked the vault and climbed back to the main floor, her resolve hardened. She had not survived this long by waiting for permission or approval. She had survived by making hard choices when no good options existed. This was no different. Tomorrow, she would call the attorney. She would begin the process of transforming discovery into ownership. And she would do so carefully, methodically, with the same discipline that had kept her and Lucia alive when everything else had collapsed. The factory settled around her as she returned to their small room. Outside, the town slept, unaware of what was unfolding within the condemned building they had long since written off as worthless. But Maya knew better now. Worthless was a judgment made by people who had stopped looking closely. And sometimes, hidden beneath layers of rust and neglect, lay the kind of truth that changed everything. The attorney's name was Richard Portman, and his office was located in a professional building 20 miles from the town, far enough to suggest discretion, close enough to indicate local knowledge. Maya called the next morning and scheduled an appointment, keeping her explanation brief. Property inheritance. Complex questions. The secretary asked nothing further. The meeting was set for 3 days later, giving Maya time she used productively. She researched Portman thoroughly, finding a career built on estate law and property disputes. His reputation suggested competence without flash, exactly what she needed. She also returned to the vault multiple times, refining her documentation, photographing every box and bar from multiple angles, ensuring she had evidence that could not be easily dismissed or questioned. During this time, the car she had noticed reappeared twice, always parked at a distance, always leaving before she could approach. The surveillance was not aggressive, but it was deliberate. Someone was tracking her movements, and the why of it unsettled her more than the act itself. She mentioned nothing of this to Lucia, maintaining the fiction that everything was progressing normally. But she began taking precautions, varying the time she left the factory, checking over her shoulder more frequently, locking doors she had previously left accessible. On the day of the meeting, she dressed as professionally as her limited wardrobe allowed and took the bus to Portman's office. The building was modern but understated, the kind of place where wealth was discussed quietly and agreements were documented with precision. Portman himself was in his 50s, gray-haired and composed, with the manner of someone accustomed to hearing complicated stories without judgment. He gestured for Maya to sit and listened as she explained her situation, starting with the inheritance and ending with the discovery of the vault. She showed him the photographs, the measurements, the verification from the precious metals dealer. When she finished, Portman leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his tone measured. "This is extraordinary and legally complex. You understand that?" "I do. The first question is ownership. Based on what you've described, the property transferred legally to you. The vault and its contents were not excluded from the transfer, which suggests they belong to you as well. However, if someone can prove they had prior claim to the platinum, if it was stolen, for example, or if the original purchaser's heirs can demonstrate ownership, they could challenge you in court. How likely is that? Difficult to say. The factory closed in the mid-'80s. If the platinum was stockpiled before then, the original owners or their heirs would need to prove they intended to retrieve it and were prevented from doing so. 40 years is a long time. Memories fade. Documentation disappears. But the value here is significant enough that people will look very hard for grounds to make a claim. Maya absorbed this, her hands folded tightly in her lap. What should I do? Portman considered carefully. First, we establish clear provenance. We document everything about the transfer of the property to you. We confirm that your great-aunt acquired it legally and transferred it without exclusions. Second, we attempt to identify who placed the platinum in the vault and whether they or their heirs still have any legal standing. This will require research, possibly hiring an investigator. Third, and most importantly, we proceed carefully. The moment this becomes public, you will lose control of the narrative. People will make claims, legitimate or otherwise. The press will amplify every rumor. Your life will become very complicated very quickly. So what do you recommend? Quiet verification. Establish your legal position before anyone else knows what you've found. Then, when you're ready, engage the authorities in a way that protects your interests. The IRS will need to be involved eventually. So will local law enforcement if there's any question about how the platinum came to be there. But all of that happens on your terms, with legal protection in place. Maya nodded slowly. And your fee? For this kind of case, I work on contingency plus expenses. If we secure your ownership, I take 15% of the total value. If we don't, you pay only the direct costs of investigation and filing. The number was staggering, 15% of millions, but she understood the logic. Portman was taking a risk by associating himself with a case that could become very public and very contentious. His fee reflected that risk. "I agree," she said. They shook hands, and Portman pulled out a legal pad, beginning the process of documenting every detail she could provide. The meeting lasted 3 hours, by the end of which Maya felt both relieved and more anxious than before. She had an attorney, a plan, and a path forward. But she also understood, more clearly than ever, how many ways this could go wrong. Returning to the factory that evening, she found Lucia sitting outside on the steps, her backpack beside her. The sight sent immediate alarm through Maya's chest. "What's wrong?" she asked, kneeling beside her daughter. Lucia looked up, her expression troubled. "Some kids at school were talking. They said we're living in a haunted building. They said their parents think you're crazy for staying here. Maya pulled her close, anger and protectiveness surging through her. What else did they say? That we're going to get hurt, that the building is going to fall down, that we should leave before something bad happens. Maya held her daughter tightly, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought them to this moment. Lucia was 8 years old. She should have been worried about homework and friendships, not whether the roof over her head would collapse. The injustice of it burned. Listen to me, Maya said firmly. This building is old, yes, but it's strong, stronger than people think, and we're going to be fine. I promise you. Lucia nodded against her shoulder, wanting to believe, but unable to fully hide her doubt. Maya stood and guided her inside, locking the door behind them with deliberate care. That night, as Lucia slept, Maya made another decision. She could not keep living in uncertainty, waiting for legal processes to resolve themselves while her daughter absorbed the cruelty of children repeating their parents' judgments. She needed to accelerate the plan, to move from quiet verification to decisive action. She called Portman the next morning and told him to begin the formal process immediately. File the necessary paperwork, engage the authorities, establish her claim publicly, and let the consequences unfold as they would. Portman hesitated, warning her again about the loss of control that would follow. But Maya's resolve was firm. She had spent her entire adult life reacting to circumstances she could not influence. This was different. She had found something extraordinary, something that could change the trajectory of her life and her daughter's future. She would not lose it because she had been too cautious to act. Do it, she said. File everything. Make it official. Portman agreed, and within 48 hours, the machinery of law and bureaucracy began to turn. Documentation was submitted to county officials. Appraisers were scheduled. The IRS was notified of a significant asset discovery. Local law enforcement was informed as protocol required. And then, as Portman had warned, the news spread. It began with a brief mention in the county records, noticed by a clerk who mentioned it to a friend. The friend told a reporter from a regional newspaper, always hungry for stories that broke the monotony of local politics and school board meetings. The reporter called Portman's office, was redirected through layers of professional courtesy, and eventually published a story that was cautious in its language but explosive in its implications. Local woman discovers fortune in inherited factory. The headline appeared online first, then in print. Within hours, it had been picked up by larger outlets. By the next day, television crews had arrived in the town, setting up outside the factory and interviewing anyone willing to talk. Maya watched it unfold from inside the building. The world outside transformed into a circus she had not invited but could no longer avoid. Reporters knocked on the door. Neighbors who had never spoken to her suddenly appeared with advice and warnings. People she had never met claimed connections to the factory, to her great-aunt, to the history of the building. And through it all, the question everyone asked was the same. How much is it worth? Portman handled the media with professional detachment, releasing a statement that confirmed the discovery of valuable materials in the inherited property and noting that all legal processes were being followed appropriately. He refused to provide specific figures, citing ongoing appraisals. But estimates circulated anyway, growing wilder with each retelling. 10 million, 50 million, 100 million. The truth, which Portman shared with Maya privately, was somewhere in the middle but still staggering. Based on preliminary appraisals and current platinum prices, the vault contained approximately 412 bars. At current market rates, the total value was approximately $438 million. The number was so large it felt meaningless. Maya stared at the appraisal document, reading the figure again and again, unable to reconcile it with the reality of her life. She was living in a condemned building with a daughter who slept on a sleeping bag, and she was now, at least on paper, worth nearly $500 million. The absurdity threatened to break something inside her, but she held herself together through sheer force of will. Outside, the media frenzy intensified. People began appearing with claims, just as Portman had predicted. A man who said his grandfather had worked in the factory and deserved compensation. A woman who claimed her family had owned the building before it was sold and that the platinum rightfully belonged to them. Lawyers representing unnamed clients filed preliminary motions, testing the legal waters. Portman dealt with each systematically, documenting every claim and preparing responses that would withstand scrutiny. But the volume was overwhelming, and Maya began to understand what he had meant about losing control. Then came the threats. The first arrived as a note slipped under the factory door, simple and direct. "You don't deserve this. Leave while you can." The second was a phone call, a male voice she did not recognize. "People are watching. Be careful." The third was more disturbing. A rock thrown through one of the few remaining intact windows, wrapped in paper with a message scrawled in angry capital letters. "Thief." Maya reported each incident to the police, who documented them with professional courtesy but offered little in terms of protection. The town was small. Resources were limited. Unless the threats escalated to direct violence, there was little they could do beyond increasing patrols. She hired private security, using money advanced by Portman against her expected settlement. 2 guards rotated shifts, watching the building from car parked nearby. Their presence helped, but it also underscored how exposed she had become. Through all of this, Lucia absorbed more than Maya wanted. She heard the whispers at school, saw the news reports, sensed her mother's tension, even when Maya tried to hide it. One evening, she asked the question Maya had been dreading. "Are we rich now?" Maya sat beside her, choosing her words carefully. "We found something valuable, but it will take time before we know what that means for us. Until then, things stay the same." But people are angry. Some people are. They don't understand. Or they're jealous. But we haven't done anything wrong. The building is ours. What we found inside is ours. We just have to be patient while everything gets sorted out. Lucia nodded, but the worry in her eyes did not fade. Maya held her close, feeling the weight of responsibility press down with renewed force. This was no longer about survival. It was about protection, about ensuring that the discovery that should have been a blessing did not become a curse. As the days passed and the legal processes ground forward with agonizing slowness, Maya found herself returning to the vault repeatedly. She stood among the boxes of platinum, the source of all this chaos, and tried to remember the moment when she had first opened that door. The hope she had felt then seemed naive now, replaced by a harder understanding of what wealth attracted. But she did not regret it. Even with the threats, the media attention, and the legal battles, she did not regret finding the platinum. Because the alternative, remaining in poverty, being evicted, watching her daughter grow up with nothing, was worse than any amount of scrutiny or danger. The platinum was real. The fortune was real. And soon, despite everything, it would be hers. The official appraisal took 3 weeks to complete. During that time, Maya's life existed in a strange suspension between her previous poverty and a future she could barely imagine. Teams of specialists arrived at the factory, escorted by security and accompanied by legal observers. They photographed every bar, tested samples, verified markings, and cross-referenced serial numbers against historical records. Maya watched from a distance as her discovery was dissected with clinical precision. Each day brought new confirmations. The platinum was genuine. The purity was as marked. The quantity exceeded initial estimates. By the time the final report was compiled, the total had been adjusted upward. 412 bars. $438 million at current market rates. The lead appraiser, a woman named Dr. Ellen Vasquez, sat with Maya in the small office space they had cleared within the factory. She spread the documents across a makeshift table, her manner professional but not unkind. "This is one of the largest private platinum discoveries in recent history," Dr. Vasquez explained. The bars were manufactured between 1976 and 1983, likely purchased as a hedge against inflation during a period of economic uncertainty. Whoever acquired them understood precious metals. They also understood the value of patience. "Do you know who bought them?" Maya asked. Dr. Vasquez shook her head. The serial numbers trace back to several refineries, but the purchase record from that era are incomplete. What we do know is that they were legally acquired and stored here intentionally. The vault construction suggests significant planning. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. And legally, they're mine? Based on the documentation your attorney provided, yes. The property transferred to your great-aunt through a legitimate tax auction. She owned it free and clear. When she passed, it transferred to you with no exclusions. The platinum was part of that transfer, whether anyone knew it at the time or not. Maya absorbed this, feeling the weight of finality. The question that had haunted her since opening the vault door had been answered. The platinum was hers. But Dr. Vasquez continued, her tone shifting slightly. However, you should be prepared for challenges. The value here will attract attention from people who believe they have legitimate claims. Some will be genuine heirs of the original purchaser if they can be identified. Others will be opportunistic. Your attorney has prepared for this, but the process could take months or even years to fully resolve. And in the meantime, the platinum remains in your possession, secured and insured. You can begin the process of liquidating it if you choose, though I'd recommend waiting until the legal questions are settled. Once you have clear title, the sale process becomes much simpler. After Dr. Vasquez left, Maya sat alone in the office, staring at the appraisal documents. $438 million. The number had grown familiar through repetition, but had not become real. Reality was the sleeping bag on the floor. Reality was the $73 currently in her bank account. Reality was the notice from Lucia's school about overdue lunch payments. The platinum existed in a different dimension, theoretical wealth that had not yet translated into anything she could use to improve their immediate circumstances. That changed when Portman called later that afternoon. His tone carried an uncharacteristic energy. "We have an offer," he said without preamble. "A consortium of precious metals dealers and investors. They're willing to purchase the entire collection for $415 million, cash settlement, with closing in 30 days. They'll assume all remaining legal risks and handle any claims that arise." Maya's breath caught. $415 million. It's below the appraised value, but not by much. They're accounting for risk and the complexity of liquidating this much platinum at once. The advantage is speed and certainty. You walk away with a guaranteed sum, free and clear, and let them deal with any legal challenges. What do you recommend? Portman was silent for a moment. Normally, I'd advise negotiating or waiting for clear title before selling. But your situation is unusual. The media attention has made you a target. The threats are escalating, and you have a daughter to protect. $415 million, after taxes and fees, will leave you with approximately $230 million. That's generational wealth, life-changing money, and it comes with the benefit of removing you from the center of this circus. Maya closed her eyes, thinking. She had never imagined wealth on this scale. She had hoped, at best, for enough to secure stable housing and rebuild her savings. $230 million was so far beyond that it felt like a different universe entirely. How soon do they need an answer? They're giving us 72 hours. After that, the offer expires. I'll call you back in an hour. Maya ended the call and sat in silence, the factory creaking around her. Outside, she could hear the murmur of reporters who had become a permanent fixture, waiting for developments. Inside, Lucia was doing homework in their small room, oblivious to the decision being made. The choice felt both impossible and obvious. Accepting meant safety, certainty, and the ability to rebuild their lives without the constant pressure of public scrutiny. Rejecting it meant holding out for possibly more money, but definitely more risk, more time in this condemned building, more exposure to people who resented what she had found. She thought about the woman at the hardware store who had mocked her accent, the man at the diner who had laughed at her attempt to fix up the factory, the neighbors who had whispered about the crazy city woman squatting in a dangerous building. She thought about every rejection letter, every closed door, every moment when the world had communicated clearly that she did not matter. The platinum had changed that. It had forced people to pay attention, to take her seriously, to acknowledge that she had value. But it had also painted a target on her back and placed her daughter in proximity to danger she had never intended. The decision crystallized. She called Portman back. "Accept the offer. Draft the paperwork. Let's close this as quickly as possible." Portman's relief was audible. "I'll start the process immediately." "Congratulations, Maya. This is going to change everything." The next 72 hours moved with surreal speed. Lawyers drafted contracts. Financial advisors appeared to discuss tax strategies and wealth management. Security increased as word spread that a sale was imminent. The factory, which had felt like a prison for weeks, suddenly felt like the center of a machinery she did not fully understand but was learning to navigate. The media coverage intensified. Reporters wanted her story, her reaction, her plans for the money. Portman fielded most requests, releasing carefully worded statements that confirmed the sale while revealing little about Maya's personal circumstances. But some journalists were more persistent, digging into her background, finding the eviction notice, the job losses, the years of struggle that had preceded this moment. The narrative they constructed was predictable. Struggling single mother strikes it rich. Rags to riches. The American dream realized through luck and perseverance. Maya read these articles with complicated emotions. The facts were accurate, but the framing felt reductive, as if her entire life could be summarized as a prelude to this windfall. Still, the attention had one beneficial effect. People who had dismissed her weeks earlier now approached with sudden friendliness. The hardware store owner who had been coldly polite suddenly offered her credit and assistance with renovations. The diner owner who had let others mock her now insisted her meals were complimentary. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now stopped to congratulate her and share stories about their own connections to the factory. Maya accepted these gestures with polite restraint, understanding that she was seeing human nature in its most transparent form. People responded to wealth with deference, regardless of whether that wealth had been earned or stumbled upon. The change in treatment did not make her bitter, exactly. It made her clear-eyed about the mechanisms that govern social interaction. Helen Torres, the woman who had warned her weeks earlier, appeared again one afternoon. She stood at the factory entrance, waiting patiently until Maya noticed her. "I wanted to apologize," Helen said without preamble. Maya invited her inside, and they walked to the small office space. Helen looked around, her expression thoughtful. "My father worked here for 30 years, Helen said. "When the factory closed, it destroyed him. He never recovered from losing his job. He died thinking he'd failed his family, that his work hadn't mattered. I've hated this building for a long time because of that." "Understand," Maya said quietly, "but I was wrong to warn you away. You didn't create the history here. You just inherited it. And what you found, my father would have been amazed. He used to talk about how the factory owners were always secretive, how there were parts of the building workers never accessed. He suspected something was hidden, but he never knew what. The platinum was probably their insurance," Maya said, "in case the business failed." Helen nodded. "They protected themselves. The workers got nothing. That's the part that still stings. But I'm glad you found it. I'm glad someone who needed it got it, rather than it sitting here forever or going to people who already have everything." The conversation stayed with Maya long after Helen left. It reminded her that the factory's history was complicated, layered with loss and resentment that had nothing to do with her, but that she had become connected to through inheritance. She could not undo the past, but she could acknowledge it. And perhaps, in time, she could do something that honored the people who had worked here. The closing occurred on a Thursday morning in a conference room at Portman's office. Maya signed document after document, her hand cramping from the repetition. Across the table sat representatives from the consortium, businesslike and efficient. The transaction was purely financial, devoid of ceremony or emotion. When the final signature was placed, the lead representative stood and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Rodriguez. The funds will be transferred to your designated accounts within 24 hours. Maya shook his hand, feeling nothing in particular. She had expected some kind of emotional release, joy or relief or vindication. Instead, she felt only a muted sense of completion, as if she had finished a task rather than transformed her life. Portman walked her out afterward, his expression satisfied. "You should celebrate. This is extraordinary." "I will," Maya said, though she was not sure what celebration would look like. That evening, she returned to the factory one last time before the security team began the process of removing the platinum for transport. She descended to the vault, now empty except for the shelves that had held the boxes. The space felt smaller without its contents, ordinary in a way it had not been when filled with fortune. She stood in the center of the room, remembering the moment she had first opened the door. The fear and hope, the disbelief, the dawning understanding that her life had changed in an instant. It had been terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, and now it was over. She closed the vault door for the last time and climbed back to the main floor. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the factory floor. She looked around at the space that had been both shelter and burden, blessing and curse. Tomorrow, she and Lucia would leave this place. They would move into temporary housing while she figured out what came next. The factory would be sold eventually, or perhaps donated. She had not decided yet. But tonight, for a few more hours, it was still hers. The money arrived the next morning, exactly as promised. Maya sat in the hotel room she had rented, a significant upgrade from the motel she could barely afford weeks earlier, and stared at her laptop screen. The numbers in her bank account had changed so dramatically that they looked like an error. $231,642,817. She refreshed the page. The numbers remained. Lucia sat beside her on the bed, looking at the screen with wide eyes. "Is that real?" "It's real," Maya said softly. "What does it mean?" Maya closed the laptop and pulled her daughter close. "It means we don't have to worry anymore. About rent. About food. About anything. We're safe now." Lucia was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she asked, "Can I have my own room?" Maya laughed, the sound breaking through the tension she had carried for months. "Yes, you can have your own room, with whatever furniture you want, and whatever toys you want, and we'll never have to move again unless we choose to." The tears came then, unexpected and overwhelming. Maya held Lucia as they both cried, releasing weeks of fear and uncertainty and exhaustion. When they finally stopped, Maya felt lighter than she had in years. For the first 3 days after the money arrived, Maya did nothing. She and Lucia stayed in the hotel room, ordering room service for the first time in their lives and watching movies on the large television. They did not leave except for brief walks around the block. Maya checked her bank account compulsively, refreshing the page every few hours to confirm the numbers had not disappeared. On the 4th day, Lucia asked if they could go shopping for new clothes. Her school uniform was wearing thin, and her winter coat had a broken zipper Maya had been meaning to repair but had never found time or resources to address. Maya agreed, and they took a taxi to a department store in the city center. Inside, Maya experienced a disorientation she had not anticipated. For years, she had shopped with ruthless efficiency, calculating prices before touching items, steering Lucia away from anything beyond their budget, moving through stores with the practiced speed of someone who could not afford to linger. Now, standing in the children's section with effectively unlimited resources, she found herself paralyzed. Lucia held up a coat, nicer than anything she had owned. "Can I get this one?" Maya looked at the price tag. $140. A month ago, that would have represented an impossible expense, something they would have worked around by finding alternatives at thrift stores or waiting for clearance sales. Now it was negligible, less than the interest or money would earn in the few minutes they spent in this store. "Yes," Maya said, her voice catching slightly. "You can get that one, and anything else you need." Lucia's eyes widened. "Anything?" Maya nodded, feeling tears threaten. "Anything." They spent 2 hours in the store. Lucia selected clothes with the careful deliberation of someone unaccustomed to choice, frequently asking if items were okay, if they cost too much, if Maya was sure. Each question broke Maya's heart a little more, a reminder of how thoroughly poverty had trained her daughter to minimize her needs. You don't have to worry about prices anymore, Maya told her gently. I know that's hard to believe. I'm still getting used to it too. But we can afford whatever you want now. Lucia processed this, then asked, what about other people? The people we knew before? The question struck Maya as both mature and devastating. Her 8-year-old daughter was already thinking about inequality, about the randomness of their fortune, about the people left behind. We're going to help them, Maya promised. As much as we can. But right now, I need you to understand that it's okay to have things. You're not being selfish by wanting a warm coat. They left the store with bags full of clothes, shoes, and small luxuries Lucia had never allowed herself to want aloud. In the taxi back to the hotel, Lucia held Maya's hand tightly. Mom, are you happy? Maya considered the question carefully. Happy felt too simple for what she was experiencing. Relief, yes. Disbelief, certainly. But also grief for the years they had struggled, anger at the systems that had made that struggle necessary, and a complicated guilt about having been chosen by chance when so many others remained trapped. I'm grateful, Maya said finally, and I'm glad we're safe. That's what matters most. That evening, Maya made her first significant purchase beyond immediate necessities. She called the motel where they had stayed during their first desperate weeks in town, the place that charged by the hour but had shown them mercy when they had nowhere else to go. She spoke to the owner, a weary man named Richard who had seen too much hardship to judge anyone else's circumstances. I want to pay for a month's rent for anyone who needs emergency housing, Maya told him. No questions asked. If someone comes to you desperate, you give them a room, and I'll cover the cost. Richard was silent for a long moment. You're serious. Completely serious. Send me the invoices monthly. I'll pay them. That's generous. More than generous. It's necessary, Maya said, and it's the least I can do. She hung up feeling like she had taken her first real step toward using the money in ways that aligned with her values. The amount was modest in the context of her total wealth, a few $1,000s a month at most. But for the people who would benefit, it represented the difference between sleeping in a car and sleeping in a bed. Over the following days, Maya began making a list, not of things she wanted to buy for herself, but of debts she wanted to repay, both literal and moral. The seamstress shop where she had worked for 6 years had closed, but the owner had been kind to her. She tracked him down and sent a check with a note thanking him for giving her a chance when others would not. The neighbor who had watched Lucia during those frantic early days received a check large enough to pay off her mortgage. The retired teacher who had asked no questions when Maya needed help received funding for a literacy program she had always wanted to start. The woman at the grocery store who had occasionally let Maya slide when she was a few dollars short received enough money to send her own daughter to college. Maya did not announce these gifts publicly. She sent them quietly, with brief notes expressing gratitude for kindnesses that had mattered more than the recipients probably realized. Some people called her overwhelmed and tearful. Others sent thank you cards with messages that Maya saved in a box she kept by her bedside. But not all responses were positive. One man she had tried to help, someone who had given her directions when she first arrived in town, called her angrily, insulted by what he perceived as charity he had not asked for. I don't need your pity, he said. Keep your money. Maya accepted the rejection without argument, understanding that pride was complicated and that not everyone wanted to be saved by someone else's fortune. She deposited the return check into a general fund she was establishing for community needs. The incident reminded her that money, even when offered with good intentions, carried power dynamics that could harm as easily as help. She would need to be thoughtful about how she gave, ensuring that her generosity did not become another form of control or judgment. As word of her quiet philanthropy spread, requests began arriving. Letters appeared at the hotel, then at Portman's office once people figured out how to reach her. Some were heartbreaking. Medical bills that families could not pay, educational opportunities just out of reach, homes on the verge of foreclosure. Others were opportunistic, thinly veiled demands from people who felt entitled to her wealth for reasons they could not quite articulate. Maya read every letter. She hired someone to help her sort through them, to verify stories and identify genuine need versus manipulation. But she insisted on making final decisions herself, unwilling to delegate the responsibility of choosing who received help. One letter came from a woman named Sandra who lived 3 states away. She had read about Maya's story in the news and was writing not to ask for money, but to share her own experience. She had been evicted 6 months earlier, lost custody of her children to the state, and was living in her car while working 2 jobs. She was not asking for help, she wrote. She just wanted Maya to know that she understood, that she saw her story not as a fairy tale, but as a reminder of how thin the margin was between survival and catastrophe. Maya called her that night. They spoke for 2 hours, crying together, sharing stories that only people who had lived through similar circumstances could fully understand. When the call ended, Maya transferred enough money to Sandra's account to cover 6 months of rent, legal fees to fight for custody of her children, and a buffer to allow her to reduce her hours and focus on rebuilding her life. Why? Sandra asked, her voice breaking. Why me? There's so many others. Because I read your letter, and I saw myself, Maya said simply. And because I can. That's the only reason I need. These interactions changed Maya's understanding of her wealth. It was not just about security for herself and Lucia, though that remained paramount. It was about recognizing that her fortune had been produced by chance, not virtue, and that chance could have selected anyone. She had no moral claim to deserve the platinum more than the next person who had needed it. What she did have was the opportunity to redirect some portion of that chance toward people who had not been lucky, who were still trapped in circumstances she had escaped through no merit of her own. She began working with organizations that focused on systemic change rather than individual charity. She funded legal defense funds for tenants facing wrongful eviction. She invested in affordable housing projects that prioritized keeping families together. She supported policy advocacy groups working to raise minimum wages and expand social safety nets. These were not immediate or visible changes. They would take years to produce measurable results. But Maya had learned patience through necessity, and she understood that real change required sustained effort rather than dramatic gestures. At the same time, she allowed herself some personal indulgences. She bought a car, a reliable sedan rather than anything flashy, because she was tired of depending on buses and taxis. She purchased a piano, something she had always wanted to learn but had never had time or resources to pursue. She took Lucia to a professional photographer and commissioned family portraits, wanted to document this moment when everything had changed. These small luxuries felt almost transgressive, as if she were betraying some principle by enjoying her wealth. But Lucia's therapist, another new expense, ensuring her daughter had support processing their dramatic life change, reminded Maya that deprivation was not virtue. You're allowed to have things, the therapist said during a session Maya attended alone. You're allowed to enjoy security and comfort. That doesn't make you a bad person or ungrateful for what you have. It makes you human. Maya worked to internalize this, though guilt remained a constant companion. She thought often of the people still struggling, still receiving eviction notices, still calculating whether they could afford both food and medicine. Her wealth did not erase their poverty. Her good fortune did not balance against their suffering. But perhaps, she thought, it could create small openings. Perhaps enough small openings, multiplied across enough people, could begin to shift the larger systems that created poverty in the first place. 6 weeks after the money arrived, Maya and Lucia attended a community meeting in the town where the factory stood. A group of former factory workers and their families had organized to discuss the building's redevelopment, wanting input on how the space would be used and whether it would honor the people who had worked there. Maya sat in the back, listening as people shared memories and voiced concerns. Some spoke with nostalgia about the jobs that had sustained their families. Others expressed anger about the closure and abandonment. A few mentioned the recent platinum discovery, wondering aloud whether the wealth hidden in the building could have saved the factory if it had been found earlier. When a moderator asked if anyone had additional comments, Maya raised her hand. She stood, Feeling every I turned toward her and spoke clearly. My name is Maya Rodriguez. I inherited the factory building, and I found the platinum. I know some of you resent what happened, and I understand why. The building held wealth that could have changed lives, and instead it sat hidden while people suffered. That's not fair. But I want you to know that I'm committed to honoring the history of this place and the people who worked here. The memorial being built is just the start. I'm establishing a fund to support job training and education for anyone in this community who needs it. And I'm working with the developers to ensure that some portion of the housing in the renovated building will be affordable, reserved for families with connections to the factory. The room was silent. Then an older man stood, his hands shaking slightly. Maya recognized him from Helen's descriptions. He had worked alongside her father for decades. "My name is James Martinez," he said. "I worked in that building for 35 years. When it closed, I lost everything. My pension disappeared. My skills were obsolete. I've been angry about that factory for a long time." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you're doing, that's more than anyone else has done. More than the original owners ever did. Thank you." Others nodded, and a few applauded quietly. Not everyone was convinced. Some faces remained skeptical, even hostile. But Maya had not expected universal approval. She had expected complexity, which was what she received. After the meeting, several people approached her. Some thanked her. Others asked questions about the fund she had mentioned. A few simply wanted to share their stories, to be heard by someone who might actually listen. Maya stayed until the last person had spoken, exhausted, but feeling like she had taken another necessary step. The platinum had been found by accident, but what happened next would be determined by choice. Her choices, and she was determined to make them count. Walking back to her car with Lucia beside her, Maya felt something shift inside her. The guilt had not disappeared, and the responsibility still felt enormous. But beneath those feelings lay a growing sense of purpose. She had been given resources she had not earned. Now she had the opportunity to use them in ways that acknowledged that randomness, while working to create systems where luck mattered less. It would not be easy. It would take time, effort, and humility. She would make mistakes. She would face criticism from people who thought she gave too much or not enough, who judged her choices regardless of her intentions. But she would try, because trying was all anyone could do, and because she remembered, with painful clarity, what it felt like to have nothing and to be invisible. The platinum had made her visible. Now she would work to ensure that visibility served purposes beyond her own comfort. That was the real transformation, not the money itself, but the decision to let it change the world rather than just her circumstances. The following weeks brought decisions that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Maya hired a financial advisor, a woman recommended by Portman with experience managing sudden wealth. Together, they structured the money to ensure long-term security, trust for Lucia's education and future, investments diversified across stable assets, charitable foundations that would allow Maya to give back to causes she cared about. She also hired a publicist to manage the ongoing media attention and a security consultant to assess threats and implement protection measures. These were not decisions she had ever imagined making, but wealth came with complications she was learning to navigate. One of her first major purchases was a house. Not in the small town where the factory stood, but in a nearby city with good schools and established communities. The house was beautiful but not ostentatious, large enough to provide space and comfort without broadcasting wealth unnecessarily. It had a yard where Lucia could play, a kitchen where Maya could cook without worrying about whether the refrigerator would break down, and bedrooms that felt like sanctuaries rather than temporary shelters. When they moved in, Maya stood in the empty living room and felt something she had not felt in years: peace. But she did not forget where she had come from. As the months passed and the initial chaos settled, Maya began making decisions about how to use her wealth in ways that felt meaningful. She established a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education or job training. She donated to organizations fighting housing insecurity, and she returned to the small town where the factory stood. The building itself was in the process of being sold to a developer who planned to convert it into mixed-use space. Apartments, small businesses, community areas. Maya had approved the sale with one condition. Part of the development would be dedicated to a workers' memorial, honoring the people who had spent their lives in that building before it was abandoned. Helen Torres helped design the memorial, working with local historians to gather names and stories. When it was unveiled a year after the platinum discovery, Maya attended quietly, standing at the back of the small crowd. She listened as Helen spoke about her father and the other workers, about the dignity of labor and the importance of remembering those who had been forgotten. Afterward, Helen found Maya in the crowd. "Thank you for this. It matters more than you know." "I'm glad I could do it," Maya said honestly. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. New stories emerged to capture public interest. Maya's name appeared less frequently in headlines, and she was grateful for the return to relative anonymity. She learned to live with wealth in ways that felt authentic rather than performative, focusing on security and purpose rather than display. Lucia thrived in her new school, making friends and excelling academically. She still asked questions about the factory sometimes, about how their lives had changed so quickly. Maya answered honestly, explaining that luck and timing had played enormous roles, but so had persistence and the willingness to take a risk when no other options remained. "We were lucky," Maya would say, "but we also didn't give up when things were hardest." Both things mattered. 2 years after the discovery, Maya received a letter from the consortium that had purchased the platinum. It was brief and professional, informing her that the final legal challenges had been resolved. Several claimants had come forward, including distant heirs of the original purchaser. The consortium had settled with them out of court, as anticipated. The matter was now closed permanently. Maya filed the letter away, feeling a sense of finality. The platinum, which had dominated her thoughts for so long, was now truly in the past. What remained was the life she was building with the resources it had provided. She thought often about the eviction notice that had arrived on that ordinary Tuesday morning, the orange paper that had represented the collapse of everything she had been trying to hold together. It sat now in a frame on her desk, not as a reminder of hardship, but as evidence of how quickly circumstances could change. She had been 30 days from homelessness. She had been mocked and dismissed and told implicitly that she did not matter. And then she had found a fortune hidden beneath a condemned building that everyone else had written off as worthless. The symmetry still struck her. The factory had been overlooked because people saw only what was visible: broken windows, rust, decay. They had not looked deeper, had not considered what might exist beneath the surface. In many ways, she had been treated the same way. People had seen a struggling single mother with limited prospects and assumed that was all there was to see. The platinum had forced them to look again. It had not made her more worthy or more valuable as a person, but it had made her visible in ways poverty had obscured. She used that visibility carefully. When asked to speak at events or participate in interviews, she accepted selectively, focusing on opportunities to discuss economic inequality and the systems that kept people trapped in poverty. She talked about luck, yes, but also about the structural barriers that made escape so difficult for so many. Not everyone appreciated this. Some people wanted her to be a pure success story, a feel-good narrative about perseverance and reward. When she complicated that narrative by discussing policy and systemic change, she encountered resistance. But she persisted, understanding that wealth gave her a platform few people in her previous position ever accessed. Lucia grew older, and as she did, Maya made sure she understood the responsibility that came with her circumstances. They volunteered together at food banks and homeless shelters. They talked about money openly, about how to manage it, how to give it away thoughtfully, how to ensure it served purposes beyond personal comfort. "You didn't earn this," Maya told her daughter once, watching Lucia's face carefully to see if the words landed as intended. "Neither did I, not really. We found it. That makes us lucky, not special. What matters is what we do with it." Lucia nodded, absorbing this with the seriousness of someone learning a lesson she would carry forward. On the third anniversary of finding the vault, Maya returned to the factory property one final time before it was permanently transformed by the development. The building was already partially renovated, the broken windows replaced, the structure reinforced. But she was able to access the basement one last time before construction sealed it permanently. She descended the stairs, following the path she had taken that first day. The corridor was cleaner now, the pipes updated, the electrical work redone. But the vault door remained, preserved as part of the building's history. The developers had decided to leave it visible, a quirky architectural detail that future residents would wonder about without ever knowing its full story. Maya stood in front of the door, her hand resting on the metal surface. She thought about the person who had sealed the platinum inside, whoever they had been. They had planned for the future, storing wealth against uncertainty. But they had never returned to claim it. Life had intervened, death, perhaps, or circumstances that made retrieval impossible. Their loss had become her gain. The platinum had waited decades for someone to open that door, and she had been the one to do it at exactly the right moment. A few weeks earlier, and she would have been too focused on immediate survival to explore. A few weeks later, and the building might have been demolished, the vault destroyed, or discovered by someone else. Timing, luck, and persistence. All three had mattered. She placed her hand flat against the vault door, feeling the cold metal. "Thank you," she said quietly, to whoever had placed the platinum there, to the building that had sheltered it, to the circumstances that had brought her to this place. Then she turned and walked away, climbing the stairs into the light. Outside, the town had changed. New businesses had opened on the main street. The diner had been renovated. The hardware store had expanded. Some of this was natural economic development. Some of it, she knew, was connected to the attention her discovery had brought. The factory story had put the town on the map briefly, and smart business owners had leveraged that moment. She walked through the streets, no longer anonymous, but no longer the subject of constant scrutiny either. People recognized her occasionally, offering brief nods of acknowledgement or friendly hellos. She had become part of the town's story, woven into its history in ways that felt strange but not entirely unwelcome. At the diner, she stopped for coffee. The owner, the same man who had allowed others to mock her years earlier, approached her table with careful politeness. "Ms. Rodriguez, can I get you anything else?" "Just a coffee, thank you." He hesitated, then spoke. "I want to apologize. For not being more welcoming when you first came here." Maya looked at him evenly. "You treated me the way many people treated me. I was poor, I was an outsider, and I was making what looked like a foolish decision. I understand why you responded the way you did. Still, I should have been kinder." "You should have," Maya agreed. "But you could be kinder now. To the next person who shows up with nothing and gets judged before anyone knows their story." He nodded, chastened, and walked away. Maya sipped her coffee, watching through the window as people moved through their days. She thought about how easy it was to judge, to assume, to write people off based on circumstances that were often beyond their control. She had been written off, and she had proven them wrong, not through any particular virtue, but through a combination of desperation and extraordinary luck. She did not deserve the platinum more than anyone else who might have found it. She had simply been the one standing in the right place when the door opened. That knowledge kept her humble. It also made her determined to use what she had gained in ways that acknowledged the randomness of her fortune. She could not fix poverty or inequality single-handedly, but she could contribute, she could advocate, and she could remember what it felt like to be invisible. As the years passed, the story of the platinum discovery faded into local legend. Children in the town learned about it in school, a quirky historical footnote about the factory that had once been the heart of the community. The memorial Helen Torres had helped create became a gathering place, a reminder that the building's history extended beyond one woman's extraordinary find. Maya attended the memorial dedication every year, standing quietly among the crowd. She listened to speeches about labor and dignity and the importance of honoring those who came before. And she thought about her own journey, from the eviction notice to the vault door to the life she had built in the aftermath. Lucia graduated from high school with honors, then college, then graduate school. She pursued social work, driven by a desire to help people in circumstances similar to those her mother had faced. Maya watched her daughter's choices with pride, understanding that the best legacy of the Platinum was not the money itself, but the opportunities it had created for the next generation to choose meaningful work rather than merely surviving. "You could have done anything," Maya told her once. "Why this?" Lucia smiled. "Because I remember what it was like before. I remember the motel. I remember the factory. I remember being scared. I don't want other kids to feel that way if I can help prevent it." Maya embraced her daughter, feeling the circle complete in some fundamental way. On the 10th anniversary of finding the vault, Maya was invited to speak at an event about economic mobility and wealth inequality. She accepted, standing before an audience that included policymakers, activists, and people who had experienced poverty firsthand. She told her story honestly, without embellishment. The eviction notice, the inherited factory, the desperate decision to explore a building everyone else had dismissed, the vault door, the platinum bars, the transformation that followed. "I was lucky," she said, her voice steady. "Extraordinarily, improbably lucky. But luck alone doesn't explain what happened. I was in that position because systems had failed me repeatedly. I lost my job not because I wasn't good at it, but because the business prioritized profit over people. I faced eviction not because I was irresponsible, but because rent increased faster than wages. I was mocked for trying to fix up a condemned building not because the idea was inherently foolish, but because poverty is treated as evidence of poor judgment rather than of structural inequality." She paused, looking out at the audience. "The platinum changed my circumstances. It didn't change the systems that created those circumstances in the first place. And there are millions of people right now in positions similar to where I was who will never find a vault full of platinum because those vaults don't exist for most people. We can't rely on luck to solve systemic problems. We need policy. We need investment in people. We need to stop treating poverty as a personal failing and start treating it as a societal challenge we have the resources to address." The speech was well received, though she knew it made some people uncomfortable. Wealth was supposed to validate the system, not critique it. But Maya had learned that her story only made sense when told complete, acknowledging both the extraordinary luck and the ordinary failures that had preceded it. Afterward, a young woman approached her, nervous but determined. "I'm being evicted next month. I have 2 kids. I don't know what to do." Maya listened, then gave her the contact information for organizations she had funded that provided emergency housing assistance and job placement services. "Call them. Tell them I referred you. They'll help." The young woman's relief was palpable. "Thank you. Thank you." Maya watched her walk away, knowing that one referral was not enough, that the systems needed to change so that luck and personal connections were not the only routes to stability. But it was something. It was what she could do in that moment. The evening after the speech, Maya sat in her study, looking at the framed eviction notice on her desk. She thought about the woman from the hardware store who had mocked her accent, the man from the diner who had laughed at her plans, the neighbors who had whispered, the employers who had rejected her applications. She wondered if they remembered. Probably not. People rarely remembered the small cruelties they inflicted when those cruelties had no consequences for them. But Maya remembered, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had been dismissed because she appeared to have no value. The platinum had revealed value that had been there all along, hidden beneath surface judgments. But the lesson extended beyond her personal story. How many people were being dismissed right now? Their potential unseen because they lacked resources or connections or luck. The question haunted her in productive ways, driving her philanthropy and her advocacy. She could not find platinum for everyone, but she could work to ensure that people didn't need platinum to be treated with dignity and given opportunities. Lucia entered the study, now in her late 20s, carrying her own daughter, Maya's granddaughter, in her arms. The little girl was 3 years old, bright-eyed and curious about everything. "Tell her the story," Lucia said, settling into a chair. "About the factory. Maya smiled, taking her granddaughter onto her lap. Do you want to hear about the time Grandma found treasure? The little girl nodded enthusiastically. Maya began, simplifying the story for a young audience, but keeping its essential truth intact. She told about being worried and scared, about finding a building no one else wanted, about discovering a door that led to a room full of shining metal. She told about how their lives changed, but also about how the important things, love, family, kindness, stayed the same. When she finished, her granddaughter asked, "Were you brave?" Maya considered the question seriously. I don't know if I was brave. I was desperate, and sometimes desperation looks like bravery. But I didn't give up, and that mattered. The little girl thought about this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. Later, after Lucia and her daughter had left, Maya stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were struggling with eviction notices and empty bank accounts and the grinding fear that came with poverty. She could not save them all. She could not find vaults of platinum for each person who needed a miracle. But she could remember. She could tell her story honestly. She could use her resources thoughtfully. And she could work to change the systems that made miracles necessary in the first place. The platinum had changed her life. But the real treasure, she had come to understand, was not the metal itself. It was the opportunity to choose how that change rippled outward, to ensure that luck, when it struck, served purposes beyond personal comfort, to honor the struggle that had preceded the discovery by working to reduce the need for others to struggle as she had. She thought of the factory one last time, now fully transformed into a living space where families made homes and children played in courtyards built where machinery once churned. The vault remained, sealed but visible, a reminder of history and chance and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, desperation opens doors to hope. And in the quiet of her study, surrounded by evidence of security she had once thought impossible, Maya understood that her story was still being written. The discovery of the platinum was not the ending. It was the point at which she gained the resources to finally begin. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.